Slavery by Another Name, authored by Douglas Blackmon, opens with a quote from the Montgomery Advertiser from July 1903. In the North, the Negro is an alien, an exotasis on the body politic, as it were. They do not understand him and cannot do so. They talk sympathetically and humidly of his wrongs and his rights, shed some tears over his alleged cruel fate in the South, and then, if he aspires to be a laborer in the hive of industry, they turn on him and drive him out with curses and revilings. If he resists or falls back on the sacred laws of self-deference and self-preservation, he is either shot down or lynched. They love him at a safe distance. Unquote. Officially, the 300-year enslavement of Africans in America desisted on December 6, 1865, by virtue of the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitutions. African slaves were brought to so-called Spanish Florida as early as the 1560s. Dismally, however, Morton's fork ruled where blacks were concerned. It is an abominable fact that for the 3/4 of a century supervening slavery, 1865 to 1940, capricious, malicious, and tendentious applications of obscure, generally anachronistic, as well as flat-out concocted legalities, not to mention thousands of lynchings, were foisted exclusively upon countless black men and some black women who were methodically sentenced to years of hard labor for lack of monies, as most all employers refused to hire blacks, to pay fines imposed for allegedly committing various, mostly trumped up misdemeanors, no pun intended. In turn, under highly profitable pre-existing agreements to the tune of tens of millions of dollars, with an array of industrial firms such as the Titanic U.S. Steel Corporation, flocks of local law enforcement officials, primarily in the South, farmed out the mostly innocent black inmates to labor camps, where they were dragooned to work the notoriously deadly coal and saltpeter mines, breakneck processing facilities, and perilous sweltry furnaces that ran 24 hours a day to provide industrializing white Americans with tens of millions of tons of iron, coal, and gunpowder to buttress an unprecedented rise of the United States to global hegemony. Due to the staggering sums of money at stake, ruthless efficiency in processing black prisoners was the priority. On a good day, bona fide justice as modus operandi was impertinent. To wit, false witnesses were often fetched and paid for the sole purpose of establishing an official criminal record for each defendant. Once this cruel mechanism was gleefully ensconced, American courtrooms became processing centers for blacks to be sent to labor camps. Quote, county sheriffs and judges dabbled with leasing black convicts out to local farmers or to contractors under hire to repair roads and bridges. But as the state turned ever larger blocks of African Americans over to private companies, an organized market for prisoners began to evolve. Labor agents for the mining and timber companies were scouring the countryside to make arrangements for acquiring able-bodied black laborers. There was no regard for the health and safety of the laborers who were, of course, not compensated. Blacks who had the audacity to suppose their labor pay worthy, confronted a traumatic awakening. Quote, the sudden willingness of millions of black laborers to insolently demand cash wages and other requirements to secure their labor was an almost otherworldly experience for whites. And some whites attempted to coerce their former slaves into signing lifetime contracts to work for them. In one South Carolina case in 1865, when four freedmen refused such agreements, two were killed and a third, a woman, was tortured. In the course of this harrowing 75-year era of institutionalized neo slavery, it was de rigueur for blacks to be mercilessly exploited and savagely treated by the hundreds of thousands until plummeting like strange fruit, only to be hastily hauled away and unceremoniously consigned to crude, unmarked graves. A sobering demographic sampling more than drives home the point. In the first 2 years that Alabama leased its prisoners, nearly 20% of them died. In the following year, mortality rose to 35%. In the fourth, nearly 45%. It didn't matter how chop blacks in these work camps expired. There was now in place a robust, prolific, illegal automaton begetting fresh, vibrant black bodies to supplant the dead and dying ad infinitum. With the Carolinas, Texas, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, and Mississippi contemptuously shepherding the wake in these hideous crimes against humanity. In his astonishing tour de force, Slavery by Another Name, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Douglas Blackmon, a longtime Wall Street Journal reporter, chronicles in vexatious detail the inimical forces that rough-hewed the degenerate, oppressive society that emerged in America after the Civil War, one which, according to Blackmon, was, in the year 2000, revealed to him when American corporations were examined through the same sharp lens of historical confrontation as the one then being rained on German corporations that relied on Jewish slave labor during World War II and the Swiss banks that robbed victims of the Holocaust of their fortunes. The author gruesomely recapitulates how American whites callously contrived, and strenuously so, through corrupt court systems and truculent municipal and state governments, to so asphyxiate and circumscribe black existential prerogatives, to so markedly curtail their civic druthers, that the inevitable protests and protesters against the insufferableness of black life precipitated more than enough fodder, that is, black laborers, for the work camps that conveniently supplanted the traditional slave blocks that had been so integral to the obscenely profitable antebellum plantations. Blackmon intimates that any account about the cataclysmic horrors of blacks ensnared by grisly neo-slavery at the 20th century's turn was nearly successfully, completely suppressed. Quote, that the arc of black life led from a birth in the heady afterglow of emancipation to his degradation at unmarked graves was testament to the pall progressing over American black life. The voice of millions was almost entirely absent from the vast record of the era. Unlike the victims of the Jewish Holocaust, who were on the whole literate, comparatively wealthy, and positioned to record for history the horror that enveloped them. Blacks at the time had virtually no capacity to preserve their memories or document their destruction. The black population of the United States in 1900 was in the main destitute and illiterate. For the vast majority, no recordings, writings, images, or physical descriptions survive. There's no chronicle of girlfriends, hopes, or favorite songs of the dead in unmarked graves. The entombed there are utterly mute, the fact of their existence as fragile as a scent in the wind. Even effortful, desperate pleas that poured into the White House and managed to land on President Theodore Roosevelt's desk, such as the following from an inconsolable black mother, Ms. Carrie Kinsey of Georgia, whose brother had been abducted, were summarily eschewed. Quote, Mr. President, they won't let me have him. He has not done nothing for them to have him in chains, so I write to you for your help, unquote. Had Miss Kenny known that Mr. Roosevelt steadfastly maintained that nobody could deny the obvious racial superiority of whites over all others, and that even when whites gravely abused darker skinned races, the outcome was overwhelmingly good, she may not have subjected herself to such agonizing false hope. Alas, here was the century's turn, and neo-slavery was in brazen, full bloom in the United States of America, where slaves were originally sold like chattel. Now, with the gracious assistance of labor agents, newly freed blacks were randomly captured, then leased for as much as $20 per month, no less, and regarded as mere commodities, just as they were during the Atlantic slave trade and just as they are today in the 21st century. Blackmon assesses the caustic paradox. Quote, instead of evidence showing black crime waves, the original records of county jails indicated thousands of arrests for inconsequential charges or for violations of laws specifically written to intimidate blacks, changing employers without permission, vagrancy, riding freight cars without a ticket, engaging in sexual activity or loud talk with white women. Repeatedly, the timing and scale of surges in arrests appeared more attuned to rises and dips in the need for cheap labor than any demonstrable acts of crime. Hundreds of forced labor camps came to exist, scattered throughout the South, operated by state and county governments, large corporations, small-time entrepreneurs, and provincial farmers. These bulging slave centers became a primary weapon of suppression of black aspirations. Where mob violence or the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black citizens periodically, the return of forced labor as a fixture in black life ground pervasively into the daily lives of far more African Americans, unquote. Curiously, one of a plethora of perverse ironies plaguing American neo-slavery was fueled by a question of black intellectual property that was rarely, if ever, articulated by whites, though it never would have been deemed as such back in the day because blacks, after all, who were counted as 3/5 of their actual population for the U.S. Census, surely were not capable of any detectable cerebration. The slavers, who often spent more time adorning themselves in haute couture, consuming battening dishes, and imbibing a potpourri of liquors in their alfresco plantation mansions than they did supervising slaves, as these plebeian assignments were often delegated to head slaves or indentured whites before the Civil War, knew little about cutting edge technology developed and utilized by slaves in the cotton fields to enhance production, not to mention the respective analogous skills in tree cutting, generating, gunmetal, manufacturing munitions, cannons, and even assembling battleships. Thus, when slavers suffered slave losses, they were deprived of their most erudite workers. Frustrated by this quagmire and outraged by the spasmodic change in their economic circumstances, former slavers were desperate to enact a well ordered system of neo slavery by hook or by crook in order to subvene their faux socioeconomic status as underpropped by the pervasive dialectical sophistry that having slaves was proof of their royal status, lest they metamorphose from their cocaine induced metaphysical stupors into an overwhelmingly destitute caste, just like the blacks they so unremittingly trampled. Even to this day, apparently, some whites remain absolutely enraged by familial misfortunes wrought by the Civil War some 6 generations ago. A black male recently completing his undergraduate degree at the University of Chicago tells of a working class white female undergraduate in anthropology who repeatedly told black students, "I am from a wealthy Southern family, but I am not of them because my great grandfather lost his fortune in North Carolina when all of his slaves escaped." This young lady acknowledged that she only dates whites, wealthy white men, such as her desperation to regain her status amongst les beaux mondes blanches. Indeed, to hear Blackmon tell it, slavers were, and some of their descendants are, at least in visceral terms, addicted to slavery. Quote, recognition of freed slaves as full humans appeared to most white Southerners not as an extension of liberty, but as a violation of it. To that end, black laborers were instructed that their white masters were a, quote, palpable extension of God's power, unquote. That role was also imparted to white sheriffs, commissioners, and justices of the peace. Here, then, was a legal system of functionaries that enunciated a Christian based, divinely inspired behest to wield the pulverizing fist of white supremacy to maintain their fantastic, holy racial hierarchy. Sadly, that fist would prove to know no mercy. Around this time, the United States government decided to enact various social welfare programs for the many poor people in America, including millions of whites. The ideas, on paper anyway, were to establish public schools nationally so that all of America could get on in education, create public work jobs to provide economic mobility to the needy while bolstering the country's infrastructure, especially given America's westward expansionism. One of the great American ironies, these government programs are precisely the ones being so vehemently opposed today by scores of working class whites, the very ones who benefited greatly from these programs during the neo slavery era. The author writes, quote, the black family increasingly felt the repercussions of 2 convulsive crescendos building toward a climax early in the 20th century. First was the progressively more overt effort to obliterate all manner of black independence and civic participation in the South, the effective reversal of the guarantees of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Then came a fevered movement to follow the great American territorial expansions of the 19th century with an era of unprecedented government engineered social and economic uplift almost wholly reserved for whites. The two campaigns arrived like successive storms on a shore, the first violent wave smashing any creation of man, the second scouring what had been, scattering the remains, and saturating the soil with salt. These developments flew in the faces of some black leaders who proclaimed from their pulpits that times were finally going to improve for black folk. After all, in many parts of the United States, millions of whites were just as abjectly poor and illiterate as blacks, even though it was widely believed by many of those whites that they were somehow superior to their black counterparts. Blacks, realizing, of course, that whites were irretrievably soused by their supremacy delusions, had some reasons to be optimistic, as with the government programs and handouts that were set to function for some 5 decades, surely some of the crumbs would fall their way, and something could be made of them. Blacks even had government provided schools, never mind that they were flabbergastingly inferior to the white schools. It was about evangelical uplift and becoming equipped with skills, especially in the industrial arts, that would help trailblaze their march into the American mainstream. But as has always happened in the vicious push and pull ritual of American racial oppression, blacks were left in the dust. Quote, by World War II, millions of white Southerners had been raised from profound poverty, illiteracy, and ignorance to at least modest middle class status. Free public schools, consistent medical care, passable roads, clean tap water, electricity, even the concept of regular hourly wage work, all still rarities across the South and much of the rest of the nation at the dusk of the 19th century, were promulgated upon millions of the most dispossessed of Americans with a speed and efficacy that in hindsight made the Great Society initiatives of the 1960s appear timid and indolent. But the masses of poverty-stricken whites and blacks were twin siblings of a parent indulgent to one and venomous to the other. A new national white consensus began to coalesce against African Americans with shocking force and speed. Whites were arriving at the conclusion that African Americans did not merit citizenship, were not worth the cost of imposing racial morality. By the end of the 1940s, it was only whites who approached old age as the first American generation with socially guaranteed security. For the first time in American history, a broad and stable national middle class evolved, an anchor of sustained wealth and shared values that would sculpt American life through the end of the 20th century that was defined in white-only terms. Indeed, given the generous half-century-long white-only government polities and the tens of millions of dollars reaped from enslaving blacks for several decades in the 20th century, it would be nothing less than incogitable were whites not, at the very least, substantially wealthier than blacks are today. One can only imagine how misguided Booker Washington seemed to most blacks at that point, as much as he had implored blacks to retreat from demanding equal rights and privileges as had whites in hopeful return for less brutality from them, which he posited would somehow, though he never elaborated just exactly how, it would lead to long run equality, as much as political flaccidity has never, ever in history elicited generosity on the part of them that's got. To thunderous applause from Southern whites, Washington said of the two races, "In all things purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress." This ideal of a class of politically and legally passive but industrious African Americans deeply appealed to white economic leaders. If anything, the concurrent barbarism that proceeded unabated against blacks that labored in American factories only worsened if such a thing were conceivable. In hushed tones, survivors recounted slave miners labored under ghastly conditions, working in pools of putrid water that seeped out of the rock or leaked from equipment used to soften the coal. The seepage was contaminated by mineral residues and the prisoner's own body waste, but was often the only water available to drink. The contaminated seepage frequently triggered waves of dysentery, a painful malady caused by drinking water contaminated with human waste. Dysentery causes inflammation of the large intestines, terrible pains, and uncontrollable diarrhea that leads to severe dehydration and, ultimately, for many, death. A white physician, even one burdened with intensely racist perspectives, was shocked by the inhumanity. He asked whether a sovereign state can afford to send her citizens for slight offenses to a prison where, in the nature of things, a large number are condemned to die. And since blacks were stripped of the civil rights they had garnered just after the Civil War, especially with the regressing gavel of a hopelessly racist and draconian Supreme Court, blacks had no political means to truncate the inhumane obtrusions being relentlessly visited upon them by the white power structure. Hordes of desperate blacks tried to escape the labor camps, despite the consequences, which were viewed as less severe than remaining in the camps themselves. Quote, Arthur Berry was like most white men in his belief that black workers could be productive only if subjected to physical punishment with a 3-inch wide leather strap whose whipping end was 18 inches long, attached to a wooden handle. Laborers were held down at the hands and feet with pants lowered by others, often stretched across a barrel or stump of a tree. Mr. Todd whips the hardest. He would hit over 100 licks, sometimes 50 or 75, no doctor present, unquote. But for yet another dizzying data point underscoring the bitter internal existential tussle of American national schizophrenia during the virgin decade of the 20th century in 1903, the U.S. Department of Justice abruptly announced that it was investigating charges of peonage or holding another in servitude to work out a debt. This happened under the virulently racist thumb of President Roosevelt, yet blacks were so elated by the news that some, such as black journalist Charles W. Chestnut, wrote, quote, "The president has endeavored to stem the tide of prejudice, which, sweeping from the South, has sought to overwhelm the Negro everywhere, and he has made it clear that he regards himself as the representative of the people. In black parlance, a good white man. That Roosevelt did this to procure the black vote and for no other reason didn't seem to matter to Chestnut, who wanted so desperately for something to cling to. The same thing holds today with several black politicians, especially in the Grand Old Party. This is what centuries of patent patronizing, utilization, exploitation, prevarication, betrayal, sneering, and denigration does to its victims. For instance, that the late singer Sammy Davis knelt in homage to Richard Nixon during his presidential campaign, even though it was no secret that Nixon reviled blacks to no end to the point of perseverating in the use of the N word, simply may not have mattered to Davis. It may have been enough that Nixon was willing to tolerate Davis's company under some circumstances, even if it meant sacrificing his dignity on the world stage. The sheer force of oppression frequently strips its victims of dignity and respect. Davis was a glaring public case in point. But no matter, while Roosevelt's motivation may not have been honorable, the Justice Department investigations did yield several indictments for slavery. Blacks were confused, understandably, by the counterintuitive interest whites exhibited in their welfare, but they nevertheless testified in droves against white judges, sheriffs, peace justices, and wardens who had perverted the justice system, transposing it into a supply stream of black bodies for labor camps. Whites who feared the worst began to turn on one another and testify about the neo-slavery practices in their communities. Whites were arrested in unprecedented numbers based on white testimony that corroborated testimony of blacks that dared to articulate against whites. The threat of prosecution prompted the release of some blacks as well. Quote, as the Alabama peonage persecutions were getting underway in Montgomery, newspapers in Georgia published accusations of extreme cruelty at Kinderloo. Embarrassed by the publicity, state prison officials withdrew their convicts still held on the McRee farm. The assistant U.S. attorney in Macon asked the Department of Justice to send him the detective who had cracked the case against John's Pace. Agent Henry Dickey arrived by train and began inquiring how Kinderloo Plantation came to hold dozens of African Americans against their will. He soon discovered that the McCrees had arrangements with sheriffs and other officers in at least 6 Georgia counties to seize blacks and sell them into labor, all outside the regular processes of the criminal courts. When the McCrees learned a federal investigation was underway, they hastily freed all of the remaining workers being held involuntarily on Kinderloo. At least 40 fled immediately. James Robinson, the 14-year-old boy, of whom Carrie Kinsey had written President Roosevelt begging for his intercession after James was captured and sold, was likely one of those allowed to flee in the summer of 1903. Kinderloo was the farm where Robinson was being held in chains when Kinsey wrote the White House, though officials at the Department of Justice never connected that her plea related to a farm then under investigation by their agents. As goes the cyclical theater of American pathology, When whites come under black castigatory public scrutiny, when it regards injustice they've meted out to blacks, there are consistently horrible repercussions levied upon blacks. In June 1903, a black school teacher in Belleville, Illinois, named David Wyatt, and the town's white school superintendent had argued over the renewal of Wyatt's teaching certificate. An altercation ensued. The superintendent was shot, but not seriously harmed. Wyatt was arrested and taken to jail. By nightfall, at least 2,000 whites were gathered in the town, including many women and children, encouraged to attend the spectacle. A phalanx of 200 men attacked the steel doors at the rear of the jail. Wyatt, an educated and imposing man, standing 6 feet 3 inches tall, waited in his cell, enveloped in the cacophony of the hammers pounding out his death beat. After half an hour, the doors splintered open. Wyatt was seized from his cell and his head immediately smashed. Dragged into the street, the mob surged around him, kicking and stomping his body until it was matted in blood and dirt. A rope was secured to his neck and tossed to 2 men who had climbed the telegraph pole. Hoisted just a few feet above the ground, Wyatt's body whipped back and forth as members of the crowd gouged, stabbed, and sliced his torso, legs, and arms with knives. Others in the mob gathered pickets from nearby fences and roadside signs to build a crude pyre beneath his dangling corpse. Still more went for gasoline and benzene. Soon Wyatt's body was engulfed in flame. By the time the earliest churchgoers left their homes on Sunday, June 7th, the grotesque form of Wyatt's carbonized remains lay amid a heap of ashes and smoldering wood on the street. A correspondent from the New York Herald noted, "It was determined to teach the Negroes a wholesome lesson." But the Justice March was undeterred. Dozens of prominent whites were arrested and indicted throughout the South, and many pled guilty to avoid the public airing of their ghastly crimes. The summer of 1903 was a hot one indeed. As the more extensively the systematic neo-slavery was uncovered, the more venomous the relations between blacks and whites became across the country. When a black man in Henderson, North Carolina, refused to give up his reserved seat in a local theater to a white patron, he was forcibly ejected. When he resisted being removed, the black man was shot dead by a policeman. White Southerners applauded broadly. At the same time, Southern whites were convinced that ultimately their sociocultural mores would triumph. Across the South, newspapers and politicians still banked on the fact that Judge Jones would uphold a well-honed ritual of Southern posturing in high-profile rights for African Americans, while simultaneously ensuring no harm to a white defendant and aggressively curtailing redress to the black victim. Celebrated novels that glorified the slavery days and generally romanticized the South were published left and right, wildly. Revisions in history books were adopted at lightning speed, just as is happening today in the 21st century, telling of benevolent whites that gave generously to blacks, but to no avail because blacks were fundamentally inferior and were a national burden, not victims of the nation's shameful past. American scientists utilized contorted Darwinian thinking to advocate that blacks be returned to a mild form of slavery because that was as far as blacks had evolved. Blacks had tiny brains and whites had big ones. Thus, the racist historical narrative insisted black slavery was merely a benign anachronism because blacks inherently couldn't take care of themselves, unquote. Steady reports of neo-slavery, or involuntary servitude, as it came to be called in the middle of the 20th century, persisted well into the 1950s in America. Ironically, it was the attempted extermination of the Jews in World War II, and that black and white American soldiers bore witness to the extremes of Nazi Germany's campaign of terror, not unlike the campaigns of terror that reigned throughout the United States in the 21st century, that may have inculcated a renewed resistance to American racism, especially on the part of black soldiers whose eyes were opened by their overseas experiences. Further, now that black soldiers had served the U.S. in a foreign war, they returned to the country by the thousands, newly emblazoned with expectations for a better future. Coincidentally, technical advances fueled by weapons research had begun to filter into mainstream life. As such, tractors, various chemical developments, and such reduced the need for human labor on the hot, horribly hostile farms in the South. But there was more, as the author points out. Quote, in 1954, the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus Board of Education desegregating public schools and reversing the cynical logic of Plessy versus Ferguson sealed forever that the terror regime which had dominated black life over the previous 90 years was ending. It was a strange irony that after 74 years of hollow emancipation, the final delivery of Americans from overt slavery and from the quiet complicity of the federal government in their servitude was precipitated only in response to the horrors perpetrated by an enemy country against its own despised minorities. How strange that this horror has returned in full force today in the 21st century America. In the epilogue of his stunning account, Blackmon outlines the sickening prosperity of numerous major American corporations that relied on slavery at one time. The Drummond Coal Company, the U.S. Pipe and Foundry Company in Birmingham, Sloss Industries, U.S. Steel, Wachovia Bank, which upstandingly disclosed in 2005 that two predecessor banks in Georgia and South Carolina owned or held as collateral at least 691 slaves before the Civil War, and formally apologized to all Americans, especially to African Americans and people of African descent, established scholarship funds for minorities, and promoted a broad discussion of racial issues inside the company, and numerous others. How sad that today that very same bank persists in practicing some of the most pernicious racial traditions America has ever known. Today, most spokespeople for these firms feign complete ignorance of their firms' histories, proffering what has become an almost laughable refrain. It is wrong to associate our current manifestations with abuses of convict leasing and 20th century forced labor. We are sorry such horrible things happen. Never mind the unequivocal American law that patently affirms that the deaths of corporate heads responsible for dubious actions do not suspend said company's legal duties. In specific areas of hazardous waste, the United States has adopted laws forcing companies to take responsibility for contamination by predecessor companies, regardless of the passage of time. It doesn't matter whether you had nothing to do with this toxic stuff. If you buy a company that failed to clean up after itself, you're responsible, says Martha Minow, a professor at Harvard University Law School who has written extensively about reparations for social abuses. Why have we done that in environmental matters, but not on race? Perhaps it was the nonviolent civil rights activist Martin King's personal notes found in his copy of Charles Silberman's Crisis in Black and White that optimally framed the profound denial in which American society cloaked itself after the Civil War and continues to do so in the 21st century. The South deluded itself with the illusion that the happy Negro was happy in his place. The North deluded itself with the illusion that it had freed the Negro. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slave, a legal entity, but it failed to free the Negro, a person. Despairingly, America in virtually every demographic category persists in engaging in its national psychoses of delusions, denials, fantasies, while perpetuating its very own modern era of neo-slavery. To wit, in March 2010, the New York Times columnist Rhonda Kaysen observed, the Texas State Board of Education is reviewing history textbooks, and since the state buys so many books each year, a whopping 48 million, the elected board members can dictate the book's content. The board members are not scientists, historians, or scholars, but the content they choose will determine how the books are written for texts sold in all 50 states. In the proposed changes, Susan B. Anthony would be wiped from the history books, along with Florence Nightingale and Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman elected to Congress. In their place would be Abigail Adams and Phyllis Schlafly, a conservative politician who opposed feminism and the Equal Rights Amendment. Even W.E.B. Du Bois, founder of the NAACP, may not make the cut. For the moment, the famous civil rights activist's writings have been included in the reading curriculum, but his ties to the Communist Party and the fact that he ultimately moved to Ghana and denounced capitalism might undo him. The massive erasure of black history and achievement persists today in 2025 during the Trump administration. How disturbing it is that a group of elected officials who are not historians, scientists, sociologists, or even well-informed laypeople, utter ignoramuses, can determine the curriculum for the entire nation. It goes to America's love of mediocrity. Kathy Miller, president of the Texas Freedom Network, a watchdog organization, said it best when she told Fox News, I believe the members of this board, the 7-member voting bloc, are willing to sacrifice the truth in history to promote a very skewed perspective, especially on the issue of civil rights. We watched while they tried to whitewash civil rights and remove references to ethnic and religious minorities and women and the struggles we face in expanding our rights. Indeed, board members see no problem with revising the history to reflect a, quote, rosier, unquote, view of it that excludes women, minorities, and oppression. I guess the world consists only of white men. Houston's state senator Dan Patrick told Fox News, I'm glad the SBOE is drawing a line in the sand, as we in Texas have been known to do from time to time, to say this is what our country was founded upon, these are our principles, these are our values, and this is who we are as people. Alas, America's psychosis persists. With the current abatement of systematic, full-scale physical assaults, sweeping, random incarcerations, and unslaved re-enslavement that obtruded upon the lives of most blacks during the neo-slavery period less than 65 years ago, there are those, mostly non-blacks, who will have one believe that black life has now settled into a Shangri-La-ishness, underpinned by educational opportunities and bulwarked by professional development, all enabled by the melange of affirmative action legislation, civil disobedience, and outright rioting, often sparked by scores of political assassinations that persisted almost continuously throughout much of the 21st century and well into the 21st. These wildly distorted perceptions and errant beliefs, often precipitated by post-uprising cooling off periods, are partially inspired by the mistaken notion that socioeconomic and political breakthroughs somehow remain dynamic and robust perpetually propelling said victims out of their oppressive quicksands and onto Martin Luther King's mountaintop perched platform where they are able to achieve stratospherically alongside everyone else. This is mere fantasy, of course, as socioeconomic transmogrification is not that an instantaneous process. It is a chronic, tedious, enervating evolution that exacts sustained, if not burgeoning, support and continuously proliferating success rates by those who are oppressed if it is to effect significant progress. Needless to say, progress in America is at best push and pull, what with very powerful destructive and oppressive forces not at all in abatement. Consider Musk and the Koch brothers. For blacks, it is a continuous struggle to survive, much less achieve. It has always been that way, and it most likely always will be. Black success is not due to racism's attenuation. It emerges from dogged, near superhuman perseverance antipodal to mighty, recalcitrant racism. Even with fervent efforts of many whites to discourage, destroy, sabotage, redefine, constrain, or otherwise adversely affect black ambitions, some blacks are able to make it, enduring untold discrimination and affronts en route to success, and encountering such throughout entire lifetimes of blazing glory as well. The Gaussian distribution curve suggests that a teeny tiny bit of people will find a way. The bottom line, all blacks are hurt by racism, and many, many blacks are destroyed by it. Their unspeakable stories of heart-wrenching disappointment to this day are relegated to cold statistics. They are not highlighted on the evening news the way black success stories are. Consider for a moment what must be the virtual impenetrability of American racism's yoke, having been vociferously nourished for centuries via nefarious religious fanaticisms, which are running strong today in Congress, ill-gotten massive wealth, not to mention Olympian distortions of sciences like eugenics, philosophy, and history. We have what can only be called a tragic denouement, a 450 to 500-year-old intractably racist embedment in the American cultural fabric. Some point to America's first black president, the handful of black Fortune 500 CEOs, black Oscar-winning actors, distinguished black scientists, literati, and public intellectuals as proof that blacks have, quote, made it, unquote. The fact is that even in the 17th to 19th centuries, there were always some blacks who nevertheless miraculously achieved and contributed to all fields, as vigorously as this information is suppressed, and much the way the illustrious history of ancient African science and philosophy are opprobriously concealed in the vain attempt to fortify myths of white superiority. In fact, it is most often the woefully misinformed and misinforming whites, together with some of the blacks that have established successful careers, that snort the made it refrain most garrulously, even in the face of continuously grim and frequently growing grimmer statistics. Occam's razor seems to offer a pat solution to what some may view as naive behavior, but what is in reality full-blown, underhanded maliciousness. Their agenda here can only be to dismantle any and all social programs that have evolved to help the most unfortunate and disenfranchised Americans, because they don't want those oppressed contingents to progress. Unfortunately, as many very successful blacks recognized all too well, their achievements, be they those of the late great jazz singer and actress Lena Horne, historian David Levering Lewis, First Lady Michelle Obama, actor Denzel Washington, tennis great Venus Williams, the sensationally brilliant concert pianist composer Stuart Goodyear, or the eminent Shirley N. Jackson, physicist and distinguished president of the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute Emeritus, come at a considerably higher cost than it does to their white counterparts. Such is the case because middle class blacks, in spite of their outstanding abilities, often superior educational credentials, and stellar professional achievements, are not any more immune from racism's blunt force than are less prosperous blacks, as the outrageously humiliating arrest of Harvard's professor Skip Gates at his own home in the summer of 2009 elucidated. What is more, successful blacks who attack racism usually incur the ever present tempestuous ire of whites, often suffering professional repercussions for not being appreciatively deferential of their good fortunes. Case in point, actress Whoopi Goldberg. The author writes, Southern whites thoroughly adopted the rationale, which effectively held that African Americans had no basis of legitimate complaint regarding the racial climate, regardless of how overtly apparent was the disparate treatment of and opportunities for whites and blacks. Affluence does not somehow, as if magically, render racism null and void because racism is class neutral. It is as well rooted in the Weltanschauungs of the white elite as it is in the reference frames of poor whites. One can be simultaneously highly learned and profoundly miseducated, as was Stanford University's physics Nobel laureate and avowed white supremacist William Shockley. Or one can be completely ignorant and be a raving white supremacist Ku Klux Klaner as well. Both sociopathic conditions and the iterations betwixt them can and do recrudesce freely and openly in the American cultural milieu, which is rabidly infected with the racist germ. Consider that history shows us from time immemorial that those who find personal benefit in an economic system have a propensity to view the world in a microcosmic vacuum to the point of overlooking, if not actively participating in and propagating, operative injustices against their own socioeconomic groups that clearly rendered their own personal fortune outliers that are not generalizable realities that extend to their respective communities at large. Granted, such behavior can just as easily be driven by pure greed, especially in a racially homogeneous society, as it is by racism, classism, internal self-hatred, or a combination thereof. The historian poet Kwabena Akurangpari reminds us of this calamity with the tale of the infamous Jacobus Liza Johannes Kapitein. Mr. Kapitein, an African intellectual giant educated overseas, had even defended the slave trade. Kapitein was born in 1717 in the Gold Coast and sold into slavery to Jacob van Gogh, an official of the Dutch mining company then operating in the Gold Coast. Kapitein accompanied his slaver to the Netherlands, studied and attained advanced degrees, and in 1742 chronicled The Agony of Azor, a thesis of slavery, 1717 to 47. One of the most covered themes in the book is Kapitein's sustained perspectives on compatibility of slavery and Christianity. Thus, it is fair to conclude that some of those who had acquired European higher education, like Kapitein, had assimilated dosages of Eurocentric pedagogies and epistemologies then in currency and which had informed their education. This should not be difficult to understand. Throughout the early colonial period, some Africans who hailed colonialism belonged to the educated elite. In contemporary Africa, it is the educated elites that have increasingly championed the movement away from composite African values by happily latching onto neo-colonial tastes and values. In fact, seismic cultural shifts called globalization in some quarters. Tragically, it is no secret that many middle class African Americans, 99% of whom have been educated in Christian oriented Eurocentric pedagogies and epistemologies now in currency, complement the African European and African elites alluded to by Professor Akurong Pari in shamelessly trumpeting their personal successes as definitive evidence that racism is behind us, not to mention their lamentable peddling of multiple falsehoods about European white supremacy. Countless examples illustrate that so doing has brought and will bring political rewards, which in turn can morph into astounding professional opportunities and great financial wealth at the cost of their dignity and self respect. Justice Clarence Thomas is a case in point. Blackmon tells us more about Booker T. Washington's life adventure as a case in point. President Roosevelt insisted that the black educator come to a private dinner at the White House, a dizzying sequence of events for Washington and others who shared his belief that accommodating discrimination was the best route for black freedom. U.S. Senator Ben Pitchfork Tillman of South Carolina sputtered when word that a Negro had dined at the same table as the president. Now that Roosevelt has eaten with that nigger Washington, we shall have to kill 1,000 niggers to get them back to their places. But try as people may to delude themselves, the bare facts of American life continuously serve to mitigate, if not abrogate, their sadly myopic reference frames. Consider the just released study by the Institute of Assets and Social Policy that found the gap in wealth between whites and black Americans increased by more than 4 times between 1984 and 2007 and continues to skyrocket right through the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. This grim chasm reflects the racism-driven cumulative effects of unemployment, underemployment, and undercompensation, the triple bane of black economic life in America. With the economic meltdown that has transpired since 2007, one hesitates to fathom by how much more the black-white wealth gap has distended, particularly as it has been demonstrated again and again that in bad times, the strapping adversity visited upon the black community virtually trivializes the angst endured by the white community. Slavery and neo-slavery alike were and are comprised not only of manifest gross economic disparities between the slavers and the enslaved, there are, a la capitaine, vital psychological, political, and intellectual dimensions to these atrocities, which continue to fester ad nauseum in all segments and at all levels of American society in the 21st century. Since the best illustrations in support of hypothetical claims are always clear-cut examples, we present 3 telling incidents that recently occurred at 3 distinguished universities to bolster the case that American neo-slavery in the 21st century persists unabated with all of the barbarism, ugliness, and hubris that we have observed throughout American history. A black student who wishes to remain anonymous and whose name is not used in this article, had at a premier university in the Midwest what became a harrowing experience after he was asked to spend time with a prospective student. While awaiting an elevator with a student, a white faculty member who was escorting relatives around campus stopped nearby to look at a bulletin board. One of the postings prompted him to make a racist comment that deeply offended the prospective student who was of Asian extraction. After meeting with the black student, the prospective student departed and never returned to the university. He went on to an even more prestigious university on the West Coast for his undergraduate training and took a PhD in a top 3 program on the East Coast. Remarkably, during his undergraduate career, he presented a conference paper that so impressed a faculty member from the offending institution, the University of Chicago, that the professor invited the student to apply to his department for graduate work. Still embittered and disgusted by what he witnessed and by his knowledge of what eventually happened to his host for reporting it, he refused the invitation and has already determined he will not accept a postdoctoral or faculty appointment there either. The black student reported suffering 2 weeks of sleepless nights after the incident and grew increasingly agitated and disturbed by what he had witnessed and experienced. He decided to report the infraction to 3 deans via an email in which he provided vivid details of the incident. I will never ever forget that moment, he said. The first response from one senior dean some 3 days later went as follows. Well, he's notorious for his obnoxious mouth. It's unfortunate that now we have lost a student because of it. The following day, the black student was summoned to the dean of students' office and skeptically and condescendingly interrogated, after which he was told that the instructor in question had become enraged by the allegation and adamantly denied the incident ever took place. Then he was asked if he would be willing to meet with the offending instructor to review the incident, to which the black student readily agreed. The next day, the black student was summoned by the first senior dean and told that the instructor in question was outraged and denied that an incident ever took place. Then the senior dean added, "You need proof if you are to be believed." The black student recalled, "I was stunned. One day, the dean validated my story by citing the man's potty mouth as a scourge that everyone knew about, asserting what I reported was not surprising, except that now his racist behavior was driving away students. Then all the dean's tones toward me shifted suddenly after they said that this guy was pissed off and denying he ever said anything of the sort. But as this student relates, it was another meeting with the dean of students that was the most traumatizing and enlightening of all. I walked in and sat down. She came in, slammed the door, smelling of alcohol, and glared at me for a minute before saying, 'Are you sure this thing happened?' I told her that I didn't concoct the story. I mean, why on earth would I? Then she stated, if his comment was offensive to the student, but not offensive to you, why the hell did you get upset about it? I mean, if it isn't directed at you, why care?" I couldn't believe my ears. Here, her office had prepared student email accounts about the community of scholars being respectful of one another and how important it was to seek assistance when we encountered a problem. And now she was telling me that because he didn't use the N-word or some such thing that I shouldn't have cared. Before I could answer, she went on to say, "I mean, faculty come to me all the time and say racist things about minority. I mean, that's just the way it is. You have to learn to take the kicks in the chin with a smile and stop complaining when they say or do racist things. Lots of them are racist. They are never going to stop being racist. They enjoy being racist. Grow up, stop whining." The student left the office very upset and immediately contacted a mentor of his at another university. They decided to contact the prospective student to see if he would be willing to back up the black student's story. He was more than eager to do so, as he had told his counselor as well as his parents about the incident. The parents were toying with filing a lawsuit against the university. The black student relates, "I was ecstatic that now I had indefatigable proof to offer that what I told them was true. I sat down with the senior dean and told him that the student and parents were prepared to have a teleconference call to discuss the incident. He looked at me and growled, 'No, we will not talk to the student or his parents about this incident. The instructor says it never happened, so therefore it never happened.'" Shortly after this conversation, the black student began encountering pronounced hostility out of the blue with his professors. At first, I didn't understand why my professors had suddenly stopped talking to me. I mean, I would wave at them in the corridors as usual, and instead of waving back, they would look the other way or just pretend as if they didn't see me. I didn't know anyone in my classes well enough to ask about the strange behavior, so I just walked around upset about it. But then at the end of term, when I had to give an oral exam, the professors spent little time talking about the subject matter. They just passed the time insulting and humiliating me at every turn. Finally, one of them said, "This'll teach you to go around reporting racist professors." This is political neo slavery that says, "Black man, keep your mouth shut. We will say and do to you and other minorities whatever the hell we want, and you have no choice but to endure the abuse. And you certainly have no right to object to, much less report, a white man for any infraction. Whatever the white man wants to do, you must abide by and learn to live with it, or your career will be in jeopardy. And there is not a thing you can do about it, because the old boy network rules." A black scientist who has not to be identified told of an experience at a well attended holiday party hosted by a senior dean at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. At one point, the scientist found himself in conversation with two senior deans, older white males, both of whom were also senior faculty, and a couple of white female administrators. At once, one of the white women began talking about the work of the late Robert Mapplethorpe, an American photographer known for his large scale, highly stylized black and white portraits, photos of naked men, many of his subjects being black. Said the scientist, "Before I realized what was happening, both women began crooning unabashedly in my face and in the presence of some distinguished academics, all of whom were white, about how amazed they were by the largesse of black male genitalia they observed in Mapplethorpe's photographs. And when one of them turned to me and chirped, 'We would just love to see your naked body. Would you strip for us sometime so we can see what you've got?' The scientist continued, 'I was extremely irritated at this point and turned to look at the senior deans, to whom these white women reported, as I had some inkling that it was their responsibility to curtail this barbaric, in my face sexual harassment. But the oafs just stood there with a shit eating grin on their bloody countenances and said nothing.' So I turned to the white woman and barked, 'I'll bet that were I to say something like that to you, I'd find myself slapped with a sexual harassment suit before I knew it.' At which point one of the women became extremely hostile, contorting her face in a monstrous way, and sneered, 'Don't you even think about saying something like that to us, or you'll be in court all right.' I had to leave the room right away to keep from tossing my drink into that racist bitch's face. I haven't been to any holiday parties since." This is an example of psychological neo slavery. It's the typical double standard that is often applied to blacks in contemporary society, where senior white male faculty, the real power brokers at the university, together with white women administrators, saw nothing objectionable to the blatant objectification and public sexual harassment of a black scientist by white women. It was made eminently clear that analogous behaviors on the part of black men were taboo. This is psychological neo slavery born of entrenched, American inspired, sexualized objectification of black men who have no right to even the expectation of respect from whites, but who are commanded to adhere to the highest professional standards at all times when dealing with whites, even in the face of verbal denigration and psychological evisceration of the basest, most primitive order. The message here is, black man, know thy place. Another black male who wishes to remain anonymous told of a traumatic experience he had the year applying to graduate schools from an Ivy League university. I made the mistake of telling a postdoc instructor in passing that I was applying to graduate schools, although I had no idea that sharing that information with him would elicit some of the most primitive behavior I have ever seen. I mean, one day we were seated in a lounge in the department, and he seemed interested in my plans and asked what places I was considering. Although I didn't know him very well, I decided to share with him a few names of the schools that I was looking at. He suddenly became quite startled. No, rattled would be a better word. He started telling me that those programs were extremely demanding and very difficult to get into, and how I needed to think about good alternatives. While I knew that these programs were ranked in the top 10, I told him that my test scores were high and I had strong recommendations, including some from world renowned scholars. I also told him that I had some good security places in mind. He chuckled to himself and said that he would think about some good places for me. A few days later, he came to me on his own accord and suggested three programs, none of which I had ever heard of. After doing my research, I discovered that all of them were ranked below 100 in the field, including the one he had attended, although one of the programs was fairly strong, I think top 30, in a very specific subfield that did not interest me. Shortly thereafter, he asked me on an elevator what I thought of the places he'd recommend. I thanked him for his effort and told him about the strong group in a subfield that was not interesting to me. He became extremely agitated and hissed, "Those are really good programs, and I don't understand why you don't apply to them. I mean, my wife applied to Harvard, Stanford, Chicago, Columbia, and a bunch of other top places like that and didn't get in. That's why she came to Dartmouth, and she is way smarter than you, so I don't see how you'll be able to get in." The black student tells us at this point he decided to avoid the postdoc whenever possible and stop discussing graduate schools with him entirely. But it was all for naught. One day, out of the complete blue, this jerk says to me, "When it comes to me and my wife, you will never find intellects of greater capacity. We are the ultimate. We have the best genes in the world." He went on to explain that his genius was so lofty that even at the Ivy League faculty, they could not glean its power because they were just blinded by the fact that he did his PhD at a mediocre school. It was then I realized that he would never make such claims to anyone else in the department. His motivation for saying these things to me was that in his mind, I was just a dumb nigger on a stoop that would believe anything and everything he had to say because he was the almighty white man. I think he was further annoyed because I wasn't seeking him out at all after he recommended programs that one of my advisors, a Nobel Prize winner, found utterly laughable. He seemed to think that just because he knew I was applying to graduate schools that we were friends, when I gleaned all too well that nothing could be further from the truth. I had a really bad feeling about this guy. At another point, the postdoc told me that he couldn't believe that the top student in his class was a black chick. Almost as an afterthought, he added, "If she weren't in my class, I'd fuck her good." I think he thought he had paid her a compliment. Then he started talking about how beautiful some black male celebrities were, adding he thought that I was beautiful too. By this point, I was so upset by his statement that I wanted to warn the black female about this freak, but a friend who knew the woman in question said that she had already gleaned that he was a sociopath from the way he looked at her all the time, and had made an adjustment by moving to the back of the classroom instead of sitting at the front as was her custom. But it was when news got out that I had been admitted to all the graduate programs to which I had applied that things really got perverted. Apparently, when this postdoc heard from a faculty member that I got in everywhere, he blew a gasket. After that, whenever he would pass me by, instead of saying hello, he would turn his head away and project a disgusted facial expression. Then he would do things when nobody was around that were downright barbarous. One day in the restroom, I was at a urinal. He came in and saw that I was the only one in the facility, so he stood at the sink just a few feet from the urinals, lifted a leg, and passed some serious gas, aiming it in my direction. Then he went into one of the stalls and proceeded to relieve his bowels as conspicuously as he could. This was right out a caveman movie. I got the hell out of there. A few weeks later, a student told me that this instructor was making some very strange claims about my sexual proclivities and seemed to be implying that I had directed these things at him. Then it hit me like a ton of bricks. This bastard was fuming because I, a black man, got into top rated graduate programs unlike him and his pitiful wife. I hadn't taken any of advice. I clearly did not buy into his delusions of grandeur, and I wasn't moved by his absurd allusions to white supremacy. And finally, he obviously had some kind of sick sexual fantasy that he was projecting onto me, although one faculty told me that his ploy wasn't fooling anyone. My problem was that I didn't have a chance of defeating a white man with a PhD, even a sociopathic one, if it came down to my word against his in a harassment hearing with the ombudsman, a dean, or an attorney. Plus, I knew of a black student who'd attempted to report sexual harassment by a white instructor at Dartmouth, and she was severely reprimanded by a dean for making explosive allegations against a wonderful man, and just decided to drop the course he was teaching and move on, hoping and praying that the deans wouldn't sabotage her law school applications when it came to that. So I decided to bite my tongue until the school year ended, when I knew I would be out of there. It was a surreal, macabre experience. I never gleaned that on the day we had what seemed like a casual conversation that I was dealing with a white supremacist that thought he was so smart, which he wasn't, I might add, and that he believed I was so dumb that he could give impetus to what I decided to do with my life. Since then, I have been infinitely more cautious around whites. You just never know what kind of oppressive scheme might be up their sleeves when dealing with you as a black person. The black student in question went on to successfully complete his graduate regime at a top 3 program. This appalling story goes to rampant, undaunted promulgation of white supremacy in America, not to mention the outright attempt by this instructor to steer the black student to mediocre graduate schools despite stellar credentials. Finally, the instructor clearly harbored no respect for this black student, as he was, yet again, just an objectified sexual being for the amusement and perverse pleasure of this sociopathic racist. Further, by evincing a singular independence of thought, the black student violated the traditional neo-slavery script. He didn't do as instructed by a white man. He had the gall to defy a white man's orders, and for this the black student had to pay dearly with the attempted ruination of his reputation. The message, black man and woman, know thy place. The racial aggression manifests in the 3 antecedent incidents that transpired in the 21st century is commonplace in American black life. Thus, where outright slavery was supplanted with the forced labor camps in the first half of the 20th century, which in turn were yanked out of existence by World War II dynamics, together with all manner of civil unrest, it would behoove us to understand that some of the traditional wrist and ankle shackles have evolved into menacing psychological manacles, the shockingly disproportionate percentage of black prisoners in America today notwithstanding, that are every bit as malignant and confining, if not more so, than the chains that adorned black bodies back in the day. Neo-slavery of the most psychological ilk is very much whole hog in America, the land of the free, in 2025.